The Persona series is the strange polyamorous marriage between a dungeon crawler, life sim, and a dating sim, with a sprinkle of mythos of various gods and demons from all over the world on top. But Persona didn't start as this wildly intermixed genre, and instead was just the natural evolution of things Japan was really into over the past few decades. Back in the 80s, nerds with a computer in Japan fell in love with D&D inspired dungeon crawling games from the West, like Wizardry and Ultima. So much so that they became the main inspiration for some of the most famous JRPG franchises like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and of course Shin Megami Tensei, the predecessor to the Persona games. Megami Tensei wasn't nearly as popular as some of these other franchises, but it gained a cult following for its unique mechanic that allows you to negotiate with demons in order to persuade them to help fight alongside you, or give you stuff. Atlus stayed true to its roots for a long time, evolving and creating more story-driven games while including this flavorful mechanic, until eventually they decided to shake things up. They made the bold decision to remove these demon negotiations that set them apart. They decided to replace them with more human negotiations, which ended up being similar to what you might see in a dating simulator game. Somehow they pulled this off, which might have had something to do with Japan really liking dating simulators. So Atlus implemented their version of a dating sim in Persona as a system known as Social Links. It's the reason we have the Persona games we know and love today, and are what make them even more character-focused than before. Now you might be wondering, how does a story and character-driven dungeon crawler with dating sim elements even work? Well, Atlus carefully threaded these two contrasting ideas together with a fine needle known as the life sim. Some of the most popular life sim games in Japan at the time were Harvest Moon and Animal Crossing, both of which owe a lot of credit to Tokimeki Memorial, which is likely a game you've never heard of unless you too have watched the 6-hour action button review of Tokimeki Memorial. It was never localized outside of Japan despite it being a huge hit there, selling over 1 million copies by 1996 between its 3 versions. It's essentially the cornerstone of dating sim games and also happens to have a life sim element. And today we have things like Stardew Valley, which strangely shares a pretty similar gameplay design to Persona, both being this Frankenstein-sounding hybrid between a life sim, dating sim, and dungeon crawler. Eric Barone, creator of Stardew, talks of making the game with the intent of wanting a better version of Harvest Moon. But he really kind of ended up with a Persona game that replaces school with farming. It's probably a bit unfair to compare these two things with how differently they actually function, but interesting to see how closely the genres align. Maybe Persona will place an entire farm atop a roof in their next game, creating an even more freakish monster of a game combining dungeons, dating, farm, school, and life. But God, I hope not.
They look good. Great vegetables.
Reeling us back to how Persona works, the life sim part of this game means that you'll play out nearly every day of the main character's life, but just for a year. You'll wake up, go to school, and then be given a choice of what you want to do with your limited time, which is usually something like deciding to spend it with different characters, leveling up some stats, or going on a dungeon crawl. And then at night, your family or friends might ask you to help with the garden, in which case you can decline, putting them on the verge of tears. You can then run away from all your problems and play dating sims at the arcade to increase your charm. This looks a bit familiar. These choices of which activity to do are designed to compete for your attention. They're all appealing in their own way, and although you don't have a ton of options, they still give a significant feeling of choice. Especially since if you schedule things incorrectly, you won't be able to fit every activity and social link in your limited time of a year. But with some very meticulous planning, you can do everything in a single run. What makes this a bit complicated is that all these activities are fairly well connected, and that some of them are required to be progressed far enough into to do some of the others. You'll need to be brave or charming enough to interact with certain characters, and go through a scheduling nightmare to figure out how to fit it all in. We'll talk about this a bit more in depth later, but just keep in mind the idea here is that all the activities are connected. Before we dive in any further, I think it's important to get a good grasp on how exactly the word persona is used in these games. It gets thrown around in a few different ways, and we should probably distinguish them. After all, it's literally the name of the game. When the word persona is used during dialogue, it's usually in reference to the different demons and gods you summon to fight alongside you. And the reason for that is that these demons have personalities that are tied to the person who can summon one, a persona user. These different personalities are then compiled into various major arcanas of tarot cards and take on many of their themes as well. The idea of a persona, when not explicitly referred to but when explored as a theme, typically means a perceived personality. It's all based on early studies in psychology from Carl Jung. Luckily, we won't need a PhD in psychology to understand the ideas behind what the game Persona is based upon. We really just need to define a few terms and how they're used in-game. And keep in mind, this is just a simple overview to help give a general idea of what Carl Jung's philosophy is. I'm not an expert, and most of what I say will be in reference to how I understand Persona interprets these ideas. The ideas we'll go over are the unconscious mind, the collective unconscious, what a shadow is, and a little more on personas. Carl Jung's interpretation of the mind is made up of three main parts and creates the basis for the world of Persona. Your consciousness, which is like your awareness and your thoughts, the unconscious, which are the inner workings of your mind that you're unaware of or don't notice, and finally, the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a part of our mind that is shared between all human beings, which sounds a little out there, but if you think about it in terms of our brains are all mostly made up of the same stuff, it would follow that many humans would share a collection of unconscious things our brains all hold. This isn't necessarily fact, it's just Carl's best guess of what's going on, but the world of Persona treats it as reality. The collective unconscious then becomes a large focus throughout each Persona game. Carl Jung describes the collective unconscious as the reason why many myths shared between religions from all over the world tend to have similar symbols and ideas, because it comes from the same part of our unconscious mind. This also is likely a big reason as to why the Persona games include demons and gods from so many different religions and myths. On top of that, the collective unconscious is a place you literally go to and explore in the Persona series. It's typically where the dungeon crawling portion of the game happens, although how you get there and what it looks like will change in each game. You might jump into a TV or use your smartphone to hop into an alternate reality dream world. Then of course there's the persona, which again is a personality someone presents to others. An extreme example would be those ridiculous tropes in some shows where someone pretends to be the nicest person ever but is basically Satan incarnate when no one's looking. In real life, it might be as small as someone being pleasant to the neighbor they hate. We have to be a little careful though, because persona is sometimes conflated with ego. Both of these mechanisms are often used similarly as a kind of defense mechanism, but I find that these two have a very important difference. They aren't defending the same thing. A persona is typically used to protect social status or get a benefit based on how you're perceived. Like if you want to seem smart or brave in front of your friends, while the ego helps to protect how you see yourself. For example, maybe someone considers themselves a good gamer and then receives criticism from someone on how to play better. A person who has an ego that they are good at games might deflect, ignore it, or have an emotional response against it because it hurts their image of "I'm good at games." So again, a persona is like a mask that helps you to be perceived in a very specific way, usually in order to be more liked. And ego is typically a part of you that talks back to defend against what others say about you. But sometimes these ideas can intertwine. For example, maybe because someone has an ego about being smart, they might also want to be perceived as smart. Then they might end up always carrying around a really big book and pretend to read it or something like that. Like those people who have a copy of Infinite Jest just sitting on their shelf they've never read. Finally, there's one last concept we need to recognize: the shadow. Inside this collective unconscious that you'll explore in Persona, you'll see monsters that look like balls of tar running around, which are a projection of Jung's idea of a shadow. Shadows are a bit more complicated than the other concepts we've covered and combine much of what we've learned. It's sort of a part of you, usually suppressed in your unconsciousness, that contrasts the personality that your ego wants to be perceived as. The idea is that there are a lot of things that your ego will be deflecting against daily that don't even come into your conscious thoughts, and the shadow is a side of you holding all these suppressed parts of yourself. Typically, these are things that are often heavily judged by society, or maybe something you are heavily judgmental of yourself. Shadows are deeply explored within the Persona series, and you'll be spending a lot of time in the collective unconscious fighting shadow monsters, which are manifestations of suppressed personalities that develop from the general population. And on top of this, characters will often have to find and fight their own shadow, figuratively and literally. They fight the part of them that they fear most, and then learn how to accept and live with it. So again, the entire idea of Persona is that they've created their own kind of mythos that's been based upon these principles thought up by Carl Jung. The concept of a persona is heavily explored in this way through characters developing and reaching out to their true self. which is the process of learning how to accept all parts of yourself and becoming more aware of what was hidden away from your conscious view. Persona 3 started this idea of building the world of Persona and how it works on top of Jung's philosophy, but Persona 4 is where the game starts to dig into this idea even further, placing a larger focus on every character trying to understand their true selves. And this gets reflected in many of the game's lyrics, which brings us back to how the game was so intently designed. Everything connects to each other through the themes they've built the world upon. As far as why Jung's psychology came to be a focus of the series brings us back to the demon negotiations of Megami Tensei. The idea behind these negotiations is that demons have various personalities, and you have to understand how to interact with their personality in order to convince them to do what you want. Persona then takes this a step further and explores personas and personalities through social links. As for the demons, they make it so humans can share a bond with them through their similar personalities. Basically, some humans then develop a special link with their persona and are able to summon it as a demon to fight alongside them. Most people with the ability to use a persona typically only have access to a single demon because it's attached to their perceived personality. And then these demons can kind of evolve like a Pokemon once the characters slowly begin to shed some light on their persona. Their demon partners evolve to reflect the change in the character. But one key element to all of this is that the main character of each game is a shapeshifter, meaning they can change their persona for the situation, in both senses of the word. They can have multiple demons and personalities. And this is what allows them to befriend anyone quickly and makes the main character very powerful compared to any other Persona user. Now that we have a better idea of the origins and themes of Persona, we can start to see exactly how the game is put together and how everything connects. Social links were mentioned earlier as an evolved form of Megami Tensei's demon negotiations, which are a large part of those games, although they were never really so much negotiations as they were try to discern and adapt to a personality. And that's still true of how it's done today in Persona. You'll be doing a lot of talking to different people with different personalities that usually has something to do with unpacking their persona and finding their true self and all that. But how do they actually function and how do they fit within the context of the gameplay and story? Before we go on, just for clarity, I'll be talking about the Persona games in reference to 3, 4, and 5, unless noted otherwise. Nothing against the first two, or well, 3 games, but they don't share the same structure that the later half of the series does, which is what the focus will mostly be on in this section. At the beginning of each game, the main character is starting their second year in high school as a transfer student for various reasons, so we have to make all their friends from scratch, which helps the story make sense with nobody really knowing anything about you and vice versa. And inevitably we run into people to hang out with, by our choice or not. After chatting with them for a bit, you'll make a bond called a social link, and it's something that can level up. The most crucial part of social links are the dialogue choices you're given while in a conversation. Characters will typically have different reactions to each choice, and these actually matter. If the person likes what you've said, you'll bond with them more quickly and level up sooner. Your goal here, most of the time during these social links, is not to tell them what you think they need to hear or what you want to say, but rather what they want to hear or something that resonates with their personality. It's all about adjusting your persona to fit theirs in order to come to the right answers. The game ties this idea in so tightly that even the demons you currently have with you will change how well you bond with that character. Let's look at an example of this with a social link from the Student Council in Persona 3. This social link revolves around this character who I'll call Oda for short. He's a student council member and is dealing with a case of a teacher finding a cigarette in the bathroom. The school finds this unacceptable and that the culprit should be caught, and Oda agrees. But his approach is pretty crude and not really well adjusted to the situation. What we need to keep in mind here is that we aren't trying to tell this person what's right or wrong. We're simply trying to become closer to him. To do this, we need to understand Oda's persona and adjust to it accordingly. Again, the point of the social links isn't for you to solve problems, it's usually to help guide these people into figuring it out for themselves as we sit back and learn how their persona works and unfolds. So responding to some of Oda's dialogue with answers that agree with him tend to award you with more points, which will allow you to level up the link more quickly. Oda has dreams of bettering the world and thinks the best way to do so is by being a strong and respected leader. But through his actions and a bit of guidance from us, he slowly comes to realize his approach isn't really doing so well. It's clear he wanted to be perceived as a strict dictator type of leader, but he notices that he doesn't want to be like this. This happens because it was a persona he was putting on, and not what he actually believed in or wanted. When we reflect back to Oda what he's advocating for, he then actually considers it truly and disagrees with it. That's a pretty good way to realize you might be putting on an act that isn't really what you believe in. Social links like Kanji from Persona 4 explore the idea of a persona from a pretty different angle. Kanji wears skulls, piercings, and bleaches his hair to put on this rough and tough persona of a student that looks like he's part of a biker gang, although he's actually the one crushing the biker gangs because they're too loud and his mom can't sleep. This persona he puts on tends to make people terrified of him, but really he's a total sweetheart who just loves his mom and wants to crochet stuffed animals. But because of how he's been judged for this in the past, he hides this side of himself from the world. He doesn't feel like he's allowed to be who he is. We get to see this pretty clearly throughout our interactions with him in the world of the unconscious. When we first see Kanji here, we really see his shadow, who acts quite unlike how we know him. Kanji never explicitly says whether or not he's bi, but it is fairly suggested through how his shadow talks and acts that he's been suppressing this part of himself. When we defeat his shadow and Kanji becomes one with it, he says it's not a matter of guys or girls and that he just fears being rejected. Ultimately, whether or not he's bi, the takeaway is that he doesn't feel like he can be fully himself, that he's been suppressing parts of himself because he was terrified others won't accept him. Kanji's social link shows this in a new light where he's trying his best to cool down the aggressive persona he puts on and let his true self slowly start to shine through. He obviously cares a ton about his mom despite his rude interactions with her in front of others, and eventually he begins to open up to us about how much she means to him. As far as his hobbies go, we eventually interact with this kid who was forced to throw a stuffed animal in the river by some bullies, which reminds Kanji of himself. So he makes this kid a brand new one that's apparently incredibly well made. The kid loves it and wants more of them. Kanji then starts to realize the importance of what it means to be brave and be yourself. Being yourself not only helps you, but others with similar issues, and shows that you have value despite what others may think. Throughout this social link, giving the correct response is all about understanding Kanji's personality and perspective. The main difference from Oda's link being, Kanji is already starting to shed his persona, so we need to match his actual personality to become closer. For example, there's a point in the social link where our little cousin Nanako shows up and says, "I want to learn how to do that," to which Kanji replies, "Is that cool with you?" And the best response to give here is, "Yeah, I want to learn too," which makes perfect sense to help reassure Kanji's personality is perfectly fine and has value. We're helping him feel more secure in who he is and reflecting it's cool to make dolls and there's nothing wrong with a guy doing that. This whole social link sends the endearing message of it's terrifying to be yourself, but it's worth it. Anyways, let's continue a bit on the social links and how they connect us to the rest of the game. Social links will level up to 10, and that's when you'll form an unbreakable bond with someone. You can continue hanging out with them after this, but there's no real in-game benefit. But getting to 10 with a character is a big deal, not only for story and character reasons, but gameplay as well. Reaching max rank with a social link unlocks new demons you can fuse for the dungeon crawling part of the game. Part of the genius of Persona's design and how it continues to evolve is how they link these seemingly separate systems together. Making the social links create a change in how you do the dungeon crawling aspect of the game is just good game design. Social links also become important to gameplay because anytime you create a new demon, it will gain additional levels determined by the social link level of its personality or arcana. This allows your demons to learn much stronger spells and attacks than they normally would be able to, making the dungeon crawling a little easier. And this is just the baseline of how these systems are connected in Persona 3. Each game in the series continues to expand on this idea even further. In Persona 4, when you level up a social link with a character in the main party, they'll get to learn a new persona skill or passive like saving you from death. And when you get them to max rank, their persona will evolve to become much stronger, and typically they learn a very useful new ability. These transformations also existed in Persona 3, but are instead tied to story progress rather than social link progress. Finally, in Persona 5, they continue to take this idea even further by giving you other small upgrades throughout different social links. For example, progressing your social link with your teacher will allow you to slack off during class and pursue other things every now and then. And eventually you can also get her to do your chores like laundry. There's also social links with some of the shopkeepers in this game, and ranking up those will allow you to buy better guns and drugs, as well as discounts on some of them. I realize this probably makes Persona 5 sound a bit like Grand Theft Auto, and I will continue thinking that for fun. Getting closer to the arcade WizKid will buff up your gun utility in dungeons. The links with your teammates will continue similarly as it did in 4, and will also grant you new ways to interact with them in battle. They've taken this idea of social links giving benefits to other systems and progressed it to the point where now nearly every part of the game intertwines with social links. One final part of links is that there's also different types of them you can pursue, like a relationship. When taking part in social links with girls, you'll be given the choice to pursue becoming a couple with some of them, which is kind of where the dating sim part of the game comes in. Although starting a relationship doesn't really provide any benefits to any other part of the game, it's just sort of for fun. Still, it can be an interesting thing to pursue and lets us see another side of the characters. There's a bunch of different interactions for each character that you can have a relationship with, so it will change some things and give you some extra date options for special occasions, like going on a date to the summer festival, on Christmas Eve, and New Year's. The game also doesn't limit you in how many people you can date, but not without consequence.
I'll see you later, if you survive.
Now we come to the penultimate system, which are the other things you can do with your free time in Persona, which is raising your social stats. These are almost RPG-like stats with things like charm, academics, courage, and wisdom. The names vary throughout the series, but the idea stays the same. These are stats you'll need to grind out in order to do certain activities. For example, you'll need higher academics in order to start social links with some characters, like those on the student council. Or you might need really high courage for some because you'll need to be the bravest boy in order to eat the absolute poison these girls cook up. You'd be much better off just eating the ramen that makes you more charming somehow. But that doesn't get you any closer to that nerdy tech girl who strangely has no idea how to cook rice or boil water. But with some bravery and a little talk with God at the shrine, you'll come out okay. And with all that, brings us to the final aspect of the Persona series, the dungeon crawl. As mentioned previously, the dungeon crawl of each Persona game varies highly, each having their own interpretation of the collective unconscious. Whether you're jumping into a TV or climbing a tower that spirals over a kilometer into the sky, or in the endless subway depths of Tokyo, you'll find yourself running through some sort of dungeon that changes every time you revisit. The point of these places is to explore them and discover how they are disrupting the peace of wherever you are. For example, in Persona 5 and its collective unconscious, you'll find worlds known as palaces, which will be themed on a person you know in the real world. These are created when that person's shadow grows out of control, or rather in control of that person. The first palace you'll visit will be run by our gym teacher Kamoshida, who is a famous Olympic volleyball player and coach. He is known to be incredibly abusive by the volleyball team, and Kamoshida thinks himself a king of the school who can do whatever he pleases. In his Shadow World Palace, Kamoshida literally dresses up as a king, has royal guards, and has placed portraits of himself everywhere. He has transformed our school we know in reality into his own private castle in the collective unconscious. Shadows work a bit differently from the previous game. In Persona 4, when we go into the TV to confront various character shadows, typically that person comes to accept their shadow. Persona 5 pushes this idea of shadows in a totally different direction. In 5, the shadows have gone rampant, and the desires of these suppressed emotions have completely taken control of the person, leading these characters to do really horrible things. Unlike in Persona 4, the Shadow Kamoshida and the real Kamoshida will act pretty much the same way. Again, this is very unlike what we see in 4, where the shadow and their conscious self act completely different from each other. The reason for this, as I understand, is that the real Kamoshida allowed his desires and shadow to completely take hold of him, essentially making him lose consciousness. This is ultimately what leads Kamoshida to becoming a totally abusive and horrible person. With how shadows operate in 5, the way we deal with them is completely new. Since the conscious part of Kamoshida is no longer in control of his actions, it's impossible for the conscious part of him to accept his shadow. When a person has given in to their corrupt desires and wants them more than anything, they allow their shadows to take over. To deal with this, we have to confront these shadows head on and steal the source of their corrupt desires that resides in their palace. By doing this, we essentially make it so the shadow is no longer in control and the person in reality becomes conscious again. In Kamoshida's palace, we fight him and then steal his corrupted desire, his crown. And then what we end up with in the real world is an Olympic gold medal. The day after all this happens, he regains his consciousness and confesses to all his crimes. This gold medal became the source of all his corrupt desires to which he eventually succumbed. after which his shadow took over and he lost consciousness. Inside his palace, what we stole was his crown, meaning the gold medal made him feel like he was a king. But when he didn't actually end up being treated like one, that's when his corrupted desires manifested. That's a really simple version of it, but this is pretty much how all of the palaces and their shadows work in Persona 5. As you might be able to see a little more clearly now, every aspect of the Persona games are connected to each other. It's what makes this bizarre design combo of a dungeon crawler, dating sim, and life sim work. Every system and foundational idea feeds into each other while being designed with the characters in mind, all while also feeling immersive and interesting to take part in. You'll go through various rotating phases of going through a dungeon, spending time with characters, and then progressing the story. All of these things combined sets up the game to have great pacing that's fun and diverse. There's always something you'll be interested in doing and looking forward to, whether it's seeing the next social link rank or just hanging out with the fam at June's. One caution I would send to anyone now looking to potentially play these games is that you need to be a little careful when it comes to how you play these games. If you're anything like me, you might be tempted to min-max your experience as much as possible to try and see every social link in every side activity. But in my opinion, nothing was as good as my first playthrough of Persona 4 where I went in blind and knew nothing about the games. Although you know some spoilers now, as long as you aren't looking up the answer to like every dialogue response, you'll be in great shape. As far as the future of the series is concerned, it'll be interesting to see what kind of changes and jumps they'll make from their previous entry that was nearly 8 years ago at this point. I'm excited to see what Atlus has in store for us, and I really hope they can continue to build on top of this wonderful foundation they've created for these games. The way Atlus designs every aspect of Persona so intently around its characters and make them relate back to each system of the game as well as the overarching themes and world is truly wonderful. Whether you're exploring character developments through young psychology, running through a dungeon to save the world, or just jamming along to the music, everything in the game feels as if it has purpose. How Atlus connects each and every piece of Persona together in a way that makes sense is what makes these games so genius and, in my opinion, places them close to the pinnacle of game design. Well, that's all I have, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.